December 20th, 1943, 27,000 feet above the German coast, 14:32 hours. The air at 5 miles high cuts like broken glass. Inside the shattered nose of a B-17 Flying Fortress, limping home from Bremen, Second Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown gripped the control yoke with hands he could no longer feel. Blood from his co-pilot's head wound had frozen in brown streaks across the instrument panel. The No. 2 engine was dead, trailing black smoke. The No. 4 engine sputtered, coughing at irregular intervals. Hydraulic fluid painted red trails along the fuselage. The tail gunner, 20-year-old Hugh Eckenrode from Pennsylvania, lay silent in his turret, his guns pointing uselessly at empty sky. Through the spider-webbed plexiglass canopy, Brown could see the German coastline approaching. The North Sea stretched behind them, gray and infinite and unforgiving. They had made it this far through what should have been impossible, limping across enemy territory at an altitude that made them easy prey for any fighter that spotted them, too damaged to climb, too slow to run, too stubborn to die. The bombers shuddered with each gust of wind, metal groaning, a flying wreck held together by rivets and desperate hope. And then, off the right wing, Brown saw the Messerschmitt. The Bf-109 fighter appeared suddenly, pulling alongside with the predatory grace that had made Germany's fighter pilots the terror of the European skies. Brown's stomach dropped. He had no ammunition left. His gunners were dead or wounded or out of bullets. His bomber was barely flying. They were defenseless. The fighter held formation, close enough that Brown could see the pilot's face through the canopy, could see him looking back, assessing, calculating. Brown waited for the burst of cannon fire that would end everything. The final message he'd send would be silence. His mother in West Virginia would receive a telegram with words like "missing in action" and "regret to inform." The crew's families would wonder whether their sons had died quickly or had fallen 5 miles into the cold sea, conscious and drowning. But the cannon fire never came. Instead, the German pilot flew alongside, matching the crippled bomber's slow, wallowing pace. Brown watched, confused, as the Messerschmitt maintained formation, not attacking, not departing, just escorting. The German pilot gestured, pointing downward toward German airfields where the B-17 could land and the crew would survive as prisoners of war. Brown shook his head. The fighter pilot nodded, as if he'd expected that answer, and continued flying alongside as the coast approached. What happened next would haunt both men for 46 years. To understand why this moment mattered, why a German fighter pilot would spare an enemy bomber, and why an American pilot would spend half a lifetime searching for the man who saved him, we must first understand the mathematics of aerial combat over Europe in 1943, and the moral calculations that sometimes transcended those brutal equations. By December 1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany had reached a level of intensity that horrified even those who planned it. The United States Army Air Forces, committed to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, sent hundreds of 4-engine bombers deep into German territory almost daily. The theory was elegant: hit military and industrial targets with accuracy, cripple Germany's war-making capacity, and do so in daylight when bombardiers could actually see what they were aiming at. The reality was carnage. German fighter defenses had evolved into a sophisticated system of radar-directed interceptors, concentrated fighter formations, and tactics specifically designed to destroy the American bomber streams. The Luftwaffe had learned that the best way to kill a B-17 was not to dogfight with it. The Fortress's multiple machine guns made that costly, but to attack head-on, where the combined closing speed gave gunners almost no time to track, and where 20mm cannon shells could tear through the relatively unprotected nose and cockpit, killing pilots and bombardiers. The statistics were grim. On some missions, 10% of the attacking force would be lost, sometimes more. A bomber crew's tour of duty consisted of 25 missions over enemy territory. Mathematically, depending on the period and the targets, a crew member had between a 50 and 75% chance of being killed, wounded, or captured before completing their tour. These were not odds, they were death sentences delivered in installments. The mission to Bremen on December 20, 1943, followed the pattern. The target was the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory, a legitimate military objective. The attacking force consisted of multiple bomb groups, their formations designed to provide mutual defensive fire. But the German fighters came in waves, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, their pilots skilled and determined, their tactics refined through 2 years of combat against American bombers. Charlie Brown's B-17, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was hit during the bombing run. Flak, anti-aircraft artillery, had damaged the aircraft before the fighters arrived. Then the Luftwaffe interceptors found them. In the chaos of aerial combat at 27,000 feet, where temperatures reached 40 below zero and oxygen deprivation could kill as surely as cannon fire, Ye Old Pub was hit repeatedly. The nose plexiglass shattered, the oxygen system failed, the tail gunner was killed. The waist gunners were wounded, the No. 2 engine was knocked out. The bomber fell out of formation, losing altitude, becoming a straggler, the most vulnerable prey. Brown, already suffering from hypoxia due to the damaged oxygen system, struggled to maintain control. The aircraft descended through 20,000 feet, then 15,000, stabilizing around 10,000 feet, low enough to breathe without supplemental oxygen, but also low enough to be easy prey for fighters no longer dealing with the thin air and extreme cold of high altitude. The bomber somehow remained airborne. German fighters, their ammunition exhausted or their fuel running low, broke off to return to base. Ye Olde Pub continued westward, alone, crippled, limping toward England at 135 miles per hour, barely faster than the stall speed. The crew that remained conscious threw everything not bolted down out of the aircraft to reduce weight. They tended to the wounded. They waited for another fighter to appear and finish them. And then one did. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler was 27 years old that December day, a fighter pilot with a tally of aerial victories that marked him as an experienced killer of bombers. He had joined the Luftwaffe in 1935, had flown in the Spanish Civil War, had survived the brutal campaigns over France, Britain, and North Africa. He was a professional, one of the increasingly rare breed of German pilots who had lived long enough to accumulate both victories and wisdom about what those victories actually meant. Stiegler had landed at a German airfield near the coast to refuel and rearm after engaging the bomber stream earlier that day. He was preparing to take off again when ground controllers radioed that a crippled American bomber was approaching at low altitude, easy prey, a guaranteed kill, perhaps his 28th victory, the number that would earn him the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross, the medal that meant prestige, recognition, proof of martial excellence. He took off and climbed toward the bomber's reported position. The winter afternoon was clear, visibility unlimited. He spotted Ye Old Pub immediately, a dark shape against the pale sky, flying low and slow, trailing smoke. He positioned himself for the standard attack approach, come up from behind and below, climb into firing position, a short burst into the engines or the tail, watch the bomber fall. But as he approached, Stiegler saw the damage. The tail section was shredded, the stabilizer torn by cannon fire, the rear turret's guns pointed at odd angles, clearly disabled. As he pulled alongside, closer than tactical doctrine recommended, he could see through the torn fuselage into the interior of the bomber. He saw wounded men. He saw the dead tail gunner slumped in his turret. He saw the aircraft's structural damage, not just battle damage, but the kind of catastrophic failure that meant this aircraft was barely controllable, that the pilot was performing a miracle, just keeping it level. Stiegler looked across the space between the two aircraft, perhaps 50 feet of cold December air, and made eye contact with the American pilot. Charlie Brown, struggling with oxygen deprivation and shock, looked back. For a moment that stretched beyond its seconds, two men who should have been trying to kill each other simply looked at one another, pilot to pilot, human to human. Stigler had been taught the rules of chivalry in warfare by his commanding officer, Gustav Rödel, a man who had drilled into his pilots that there was a difference between warrior and murderer. Rödel's rule was simple and absolute. You do not shoot a man in a parachute. You do not attack an enemy who is helpless. You fight, but you do not execute. Stigler looked at the crippled bomber and saw not a target but a helpless opponent. The crew was wounded. The aircraft was destroyed in all but name. They posed no further threat. To shoot them down now would not be combat. It would be murder. But Stigler's decision carried risks he understood immediately. If he let this bomber escape, it might be repaired and sent back to bomb German cities. The crew might fly again, might kill German pilots or civilians. His own comrades might die because he had shown mercy. And if his superiors learned he had allowed an enemy bomber to escape when he had the chance to destroy it, he could face court-martial. The Luftwaffe in late 1943, with Germany's military situation deteriorating, was not known for tolerating what might be interpreted as cowardice or treason. Stigler made his choice. He would not shoot. More than that, he would escort the bomber to safety, would protect it from other German fighters that might spot it, would give these men the chance to survive. He pulled his Bf-109 into formation alongside Ye Old Pub, close enough that Brown could see his face, close enough that the gesture was unmistakable. What Charlie Brown experienced in those minutes was a cognitive dissonance that would define the rest of his life. He had been trained to view German fighters as instruments of death, their pilots as the enemy who must be destroyed. The bomber crews called them bandits over the radio, clinical and impersonal. But here was a German pilot not attacking but protecting, not killing but escorting, making gestures that transcended nationality and uniform, one aviator helping another survive. Stigler pointed downward, toward German airfields. Land, he was signaling, surrender, live. Brown shook his head. He would not give up. He would try to reach England, to save his crew, to bring his aircraft home, even if the attempt killed them all. Stigler nodded, understanding. The German fighter pilot had given the American bomber pilot a choice, and the American had made his decision. Stigler would respect that. The Bf-109 continued its escort as Ye Old Pub crossed the German coastline and headed over the North Sea. Any other German fighter that spotted them would see Stigler's aircraft in formation and assume the bomber had been captured, was being escorted to a landing field. Stigler was using his presence as a shield, his identity as a Luftwaffe pilot, as protection for an enemy he had chosen not to kill. At the coastline, Stigler pulled ahead of the bomber, rocked his wings in the International Aviation Signal for farewell, and peeled away, heading back toward German-controlled territory. Charlie Brown watched the Messerschmitt disappear, still not entirely certain what had just happened, whether it had been real or a hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation and shock. Ye Old Pub continued across the North Sea. The crew threw out more equipment, lightening the aircraft, nursing the damaged engines. Brown held the bomber level, fighting controls that responded sluggishly, watching his fuel gauges drop toward empty. England appeared on the horizon. They made it to an airfield, crash-landed with the gear only partially extended, and survived. When Brown filed his after-action report, he mentioned the German fighter pilot's actions. His superiors told him never to speak of it again. In December 1943, with the air war's casualties mounting, with bomber crews dying by the hundreds, the last thing the Army Air Forces wanted publicized was a story about German chivalry. The narrative was clear. The enemy was evil, barbaric, deserving of destruction. A story about a German pilot showing mercy complicated that narrative. Brown was ordered to stay silent, and he obeyed. But he never forgot. The image of that Messerschmitt holding formation, the memory of making eye contact with the pilot who chose not to kill him, remained vivid. Over the years, as the war ended and Brown returned to civilian life, the memory did not fade. Instead, it grew stronger, more insistent, demanding resolution. Who was that pilot? Did he survive the war? What became of the man who had saved Brown's life and the lives of his crew? Franz Stiegler survived the war, but barely. He continued flying combat missions until the Luftwaffe's fuel supplies and pilot reserves were exhausted. He shot down more bombers because that was his duty, because he was a professional soldier, because his country was at war. But he never forgot the crippled B-17 he had escorted to safety, the moment when he had chosen human decency over military necessity. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Stiegler found himself in a defeated nation where survival meant adapting quickly. He eventually emigrated to Canada, started a new life far from the rubble of Europe, and built a career. He married, raised a family, and spoke rarely of the war. When he did discuss his Luftwaffe service, he never mentioned the bomber he had let escape. The story seemed too improbable, too sentimental for a conflict that had been brutal and total. Who would believe that a German fighter pilot had risked court-martial to escort an enemy bomber to safety? Charlie Brown, meanwhile, had completed his tour of duty, survived the war, and returned to the United States. He pursued a career, married, built a life in the decades of American prosperity that followed victory. But the memory of December 20, 1943, never left him. As the years passed and he grew older, the question became more urgent. Who was that pilot? The man who had spared him deserved to be thanked, deserved to be found, deserved to know that his act of mercy had mattered. In 1986, more than 4 decades after the war's end, Brown began his search in earnest. He had no name. He had no unit identification. He had only his memories. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, a pilot who had made eye contact and chosen mercy, a gesture of wings rocking in farewell. He started writing letters to German fighter pilot associations, to veterans groups, to anyone who might help identify the man who had saved his life. The search seemed impossible. The Luftwaffe had kept records, yes, but those records had been scattered by war's end, destroyed in bombing raids, lost in the chaos of surrender. Tens of thousands of German fighter pilots had flown during the war. Many were dead, killed in combat, or in the brutal final months when the Luftwaffe threw under-trained pilots into hopeless battles. Many more had no interest in reminiscing about the war, wanted to forget, wanted to leave the past buried. But Brown persisted. He refined his search, focusing on pilots who had been based near the German coast in December 1943, who flew Bf-109s, who survived the war. He wrote dozens of letters, received dozens of replies, most of them negative, some of them hostile. Why did he want to know? Why rake up the past? The war was over. Let the dead rest. Brown could not let it rest. The act of mercy he had witnessed demanded acknowledgement, demanded that the story be completed, that the circle be closed. In his mind, the German pilot represented something crucial about human nature, that even in total war, even when every incentive pushed toward brutality, individuals could choose compassion. That pilot had risked his career, possibly his life, to save an enemy crew. Brown needed to find him, needed to say thank you, needed to understand why. The symbolic object of this story, the recurring element that represents what was at stake in that December sky, is the rocking wings of an aircraft. In international aviation, rocking wings is a universal gesture. I see you, I acknowledge you, I wish you safe journey. It transcends nationality and language, a silent communication between pilots who share the dangers of flight. When Franz Stiegler rocked his wings before turning back toward Germany, he was not just saying goodbye. He was acknowledging Charlie Brown's humanity, recognizing him as a fellow aviator rather than a target, wishing him safe passage across the killing expanse of the North Sea. That gesture, simple and wordless, contained within it an entire philosophy about warfare and honor, about the lines that should not be crossed, even in conflict. The gesture haunted both men for different reasons. For Brown, it represented a debt unpaid, a kindness unreturned, a connection severed but not forgotten. For Stigler, if he thought about it at all in those post-war years, it represented a moment when he had chosen to be something other than a weapon, when he had asserted his humanity in the midst of mechanized killing. Throughout the decades, as both men lived their civilian lives, Brown in the United States, Stigler in Canada, neither spoke much about that day. Brown had been ordered to silence and had obeyed. Stigler had no audience who would understand, no context where the story would make sense. So the memory remained private, held by two men who had never spoken to each other, whose only communication had been visual across 50 feet of cold air on a winter afternoon in 1943. But the gesture itself, wings rocking against the pale December sky, remained potent. It was the symbol of what Brown was searching for when he began writing his letters in 1986. Not just the identity of a pilot, but confirmation that the gesture had meant what he thought it meant, that the mercy had been real and intentional, that in the machinery of total war there had been space for humanity. In January 1990, after 4 years of searching, of letters sent and replies received, of false leads and dead ends, Charlie Brown wrote to a German fighter pilot newsletter. He described the encounter in detail, the date, the location, the aircraft types, the specific actions of the German pilot. He included his contact information and a simple request. If anyone knew who this pilot might have been, please come forward. The newsletter was published and distributed to its membership, mostly former Luftwaffe pilots, now elderly men living quiet lives, their wartime experiences receding into history. Most of them read Brown's account and moved on. Another war story. Another memory from a conflict that had ended 45 years ago. But one man read the details and froze. Franz Stigler, living in Vancouver, British Columbia, recognized the encounter immediately. The date matched, the location matched. The specific details, the crippled bomber with the dead tail gunner, the escort across the coast, the wing-rocking farewell, all matched his memory exactly. He had never told the story to anyone in detail, had kept it private for nearly 5 decades. And here it was, described from the other side, from the perspective of the man whose life he had spared. Stigler sat with the newsletter for several days, wrestling with the decision. To come forward would mean revealing himself, opening old wounds, explaining decisions made in wartime. His family in Canada knew he had been a Luftwaffe pilot, but they knew few details. Did he want to revive that past? Did he want to connect with an American bomber pilot who had every reason to hate him, whose friend Stigler had killed on other missions? But the account in the newsletter had been respectful, even grateful. Brown was searching not for revenge, but for closure, not to condemn, but to thank. Stigler made his decision. He wrote a letter to Charlie Brown. The letter was tentative, careful. Stigler identified himself, described the encounter from his perspective, and confirmed the details. He explained briefly why he had done what he did, the code of honor his commanding officer had taught him, the belief that executing helpless enemies was murder rather than combat. He included his phone number. When Brown received the letter in early 1990, he wept. 46 years. Nearly half a century of wondering, searching, hoping. And here was the answer, written in careful English by a man living 3,000 miles away in Canada. Brown picked up his phone and called the number. The transformation that the December 20th encounter produced in both men's lives became apparent only when they finally met, Only when they could speak to each other as elderly civilians rather than as combatants separated by 50 feet and 50 years. Brown flew to Vancouver. Stigler was waiting at the airport. The two men, now in their 70s, their wartime selves distant memories, embraced as brothers. Over the following years, they spent time together regularly, their families befriending each other, their shared experience creating a bond that transcended the war. They appeared together at aviation events, telling their story to audiences who listened with rapt attention. They collaborated on a book, A Higher Call, which documented not just the December 20th encounter, but their entire wartime experiences and their decades-long separation. What emerged from their conversations was a shared understanding of what that moment had meant. For Stigler, it had been about maintaining his humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The Luftwaffe had trained him to be efficient at killing, had rewarded him with medals and promotions for destroying enemy aircraft. But his commanding officer, Gustav Rödel, had insisted that efficiency in killing was not the same as murder, that there were lines that should not be crossed, that honor mattered even, especially, in combat. Rödel had told his pilots about an incident from the First World War when German fighter ace Ernst Udet had shot an enemy aircraft and then, approaching to confirm the kill, had seen that the French pilot's guns had jammed. Udet had not finished him off. Instead, he had flown alongside, saluted, and departed. The enemy pilot had lived. Rödel used this story to illustrate a principle. You fight worthy opponents, but you do not execute the helpless. Stigler had internalized this code. On December 20, 1943, when he pulled alongside the crippled B-17 and saw the dead gunner, the wounded crew, the aircraft barely capable of flight, he had recognized them as helpless. To shoot them down would have violated the code. More than that, it would have violated his own sense of who he was. He was a fighter pilot, not an executioner. The distinction mattered to him. For Brown, the transformation was different. He had spent his adult life in a nation that had been on the winning side, in a culture that remembered World War II as a conflict of clear moral absolutes, good versus evil, democracy versus fascism, freedom versus tyranny. Those absolutes were not wrong, but they were incomplete. The German pilot who had saved his life complicated the narrative, added nuance to a story that popular memory preferred to keep simple. Meeting Stigler, hearing his story, understanding his motivations, all of this forced Brown to grapple with the reality that the enemy had contained within it men of honor, that wearing a German uniform did not automatically make someone evil, that the moral complexity of war existed on both sides. This was not moral equivalence. Brown never doubted that the Allied cause was just, that Nazi Germany needed to be defeated. But it was moral recognition, the acknowledgement that individual decency could exist even within an unjust cause. The friendship between Brown and Stigler became, in its way, a healing. Two men who should have been mortal enemies, who in another roll of the dice would have killed each other without hesitation, instead spent their final years as close friends. They traveled together, spoke at events together, reflected together on what the war had meant and what their strange encounter had revealed about human nature. The historical evidence surrounding the December 20th, 1943 encounter is fragmentary but compelling. American military records confirm that Charlie Brown's B-17, serial number 4230177, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, departed on a mission to Bremen on that date and returned severely damaged. The after-action report notes extensive battle damage and casualties. Brown's original report mentioning the German escort was filed and then suppressed, not declassified until decades later. German Luftwaffe records from the period are incomplete. Many were destroyed in the war's final months, but researcher and historian Adam Makos, who wrote the definitive account of the encounter, verified Stigler's service record, his unit assignments, and his presence in the operational area on the relevant date. Stigler's logbook, which he maintained throughout the war, contains no entry for December 20th. He had chosen not to record a mission where he deliberately allowed an enemy aircraft to escape. Other members of Brown's crew, those who survived the war, confirmed the details when interviewed decades later. They remembered the German fighter appearing, remembered the terror of waiting for cannon fire that never came, remembered the escort across the coast. Their testimony corroborates Brown's account from multiple perspectives. What cannot be documented with records, what exists only in the testimony of the two men themselves, is the motivation, the internal decision-making, the moral reasoning that led Stigler to choose mercy over duty. We have only his word, given decades later, that his commanding officer's code of honor drove his decision. But the consistency of his account, the details that align perfectly with Brown's memory, and the absence of any self-serving motive for fabrication lend credibility to his explanation. The historical significance of the encounter lies not in its impact on the war's outcome, one bomber spared made. No strategic difference, but in what it reveals about the moral dimensions of combat. Total war, as practiced in World War II, created pressure toward absolute brutality. The bombing campaigns against civilian populations, the submarine warfare against merchant shipping, the treatment of prisoners, all of these eroded traditional restraints on warfare. The war became existential, and existential conflicts tend toward extremity, but within that totality, individuals still made choices. Stigler chose not to execute helpless enemies. Other pilots on both sides made different choices, attacked parachuting crews, strafed lifeboats, showed no mercy, because the enemy would have shown none to them. The war was large enough to contain both extremes and everything between. The epilogue of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler's story unfolded in the final years of their lives, when both men were elderly and the war was receding from living memory into history. They appeared together at aviation museums, at veteran reunions, at schools where they told their story to students who had been born long after 1945. They spoke about honor, about choices made under pressure, about the humanity that can persist even in circumstances designed to destroy it. Brown often said that the most important moment of his life was not when he survived the mission to Bremen, but when he found the man who had made that survival possible. The search had given him purpose. The discovery had given him closure. The friendship had given him understanding. He learned that the man who saved his life was not a saint, not a pacifist who opposed the war, but a professional soldier who believed that professionalism meant maintaining certain standards even in combat. Stigler often said that his decision on December 20th, 1943, was not heroic. It was simply the right thing to do, the only choice consistent with the code he had been taught. He never claimed moral superiority over other pilots who made different choices. He simply stated that he could not have shot down the helpless bomber and lived with himself afterward. The code mattered more than the medal, the principle more than the victory count. Both men died within 8 months of each other in 2008, Brown in November, Stigler in March of the following year. They had spent the last 18 years of their lives as friends, connected by a moment that had lasted minutes but defined both of them. Their families remained close. Their story was told in books, documentaries, and articles. The symbolic gesture of wings rocking in a winter sky became a lesson taught to pilots and to students about honor, mercy, and the choices that define character. The deeper truth that their story illuminates is about the relationship between individual morality and collective conflict. Wars are fought between nations, ideologies, systems, but they are experienced by individuals, each of whom carries their own moral compass into the chaos. Some individuals surrender that compass, allow the collective nature of the conflict to absolve them of personal responsibility. Others, like Franz Stiegler, insist on maintaining their individual moral agency even when duty and opportunity would have permitted brutality. This is not a story about moral equivalence between the Allied and Axis causes. The Allied cause was just, Nazi Germany's cause was not. But it is a story about moral complexity within unjust causes, the recognition that individuals can maintain decency even while serving indecent ends, that wearing the wrong uniform does not necessarily mean making the wrong choice in every moment. That judgment must account for both the macro and the micro scales of moral action. Charlie Brown's 46-year search was not just about finding a person. It was about confirming that the mercy he had experienced was real, that his interpretation of that rocking wing gesture was correct, that in the machinery of total war there had been space for human connection. When he found Stiegler, when they embraced at the Vancouver airport, when they spent years as friends, that confirmation was complete. The gesture itself, the rocking wings against the December sky, became a symbol larger than the two men who shared it. It represented the possibility of choosing humanity over expediency, of recognizing the enemy's humanity without abandoning one's own cause, of maintaining honor in circumstances where honor was neither required nor rewarded. In the binary world of total war, where propaganda demanded absolute characterization of us versus them, good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism, that moment of mercy existed as a complication, a nuance, a reminder that reality is always more complex than ideology permits. On December 20th of each year, until their deaths, both men observed the anniversary privately. They did not speak publicly about what they thought on those days, but those close to them noted the reflection, the quiet gratitude, the sense of having participated in something that transcended the war itself. Brown thought about the crew members he had saved, the men who went home to their families because a German pilot had chosen not to kill them. Stiegler thought about the code his commander had taught him, the principle he had upheld, the decision that defined who he was more than any of his aerial victories. Their story asks uncomfortable questions of those who hear it. Would you have made Stiegler's choice? Would you have spared an enemy when your duty was to destroy them? When showing mercy might have consequences for your own side? When no one would have blamed you for following orders and eliminating a military target? Would you have been capable of recognizing common humanity across the divide of nationality and uniform? The answer is uncertain, because such questions can only be truly answered in the moment, under the pressure of real stakes. But the asking of the question, the recognition that such choices exist, that individual morality does not disappear in collective conflict, is itself important. It reminds us that wars are fought by human beings who retain agency, who make choices, who can choose honor over expediency even when the cost is high. Charlie Brown's search for Franz Stiegler was a search for confirmation that his faith in human decency was justified, that the gesture he witnessed was as meaningful as he believed. When he found Stiegler, when their friendship developed, when they spent nearly 2 decades as brothers, separated only by geography, that faith was vindicated. The rocking wings had meant exactly what Brown thought they meant. I see you. I acknowledge you. I choose mercy. This is the legacy they left. Not that war can be civilized, it cannot, but that individuals within war can choose civilization, can maintain the principles that separate humans from weapons, can insist on personal morality even when collective morality has collapsed. That, on a December afternoon in 1943, 5 miles above the German coast, one man looked at another and saw not a target, but a fellow aviator, and made the choice that defined both their lives. The sky holds many stories. Most of them are about destruction, about the mathematics of combat, about who shot whom and who fell burning into the sea. But some of them, rare, precious, defining, are about mercy, about the gesture of rocking wings, about the 46-year search to find the man who gave the gift of life when death would have been easier. That is what happened on December 20th, 1943. That is why Charlie Brown searched for decades. That is why Franz Stiegler's name matters. Not because mercy changed the war's outcome, it didn't, but because it changed two men's understanding of what it means to be human in circumstances that test humanity to its limits. And because that understanding, passed down through their story, reminds us that even in our darkest collective moments, individual light can still break through.